Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today I've got I'm going to call it a primer video on some new research that we're doing here at the museum. It's essentially a rabbit hole that the box of blueprints for the battle carrier conversion has sent me down. So, for those of you who don't remember the last trilogy we put out, we found in the collection a set of blueprints for a battle carrier conversion. They were going to remove turret 3 and install vertical launch tubes and have vertical takeoff and landing hangar and flight deck space for an air group for Battleship New Jersey as one of the possible options. Now, we're still working on finding more information on these blueprints, and we're still working on scanning these blueprints so we can put them out to the world. That is something that's very important to us that we're still working on. So we've so far put out 3 videos. There's a link in the description to them if you haven't caught them, about what we think we know about them so far. And anyway, in our continuing research of them, we've been coming up with names of important people. We've been learning a lot more about reactivating the battleship in the 1980s. John Lehman said that by the time he got to Capitol Hill to ask for money for the battleships, he could tell someone had been there before and done all the legwork. And that very, very polarizing question, we'll talk more about the polarization in the future video where we talk about who supported it and who didn't. But that very, very polarizing question had already been proposed and people had already taken their sides. And in this instance, enough people had chosen the side of reactivating the battleships that it ended up being relatively easy. He wasn't starting from baseline 0. The person who started from baseline 0 was not somebody you would expect. He was a lobbyist. He was a fighter pilot. His name was Charles E. Meyers, Jr. And honestly, we don't know a heck of a lot about him right now. He's got a Wikipedia page. He's got a couple paragraphs on it. You can find his obituary out there. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2016 at the age of 91. I don't know what happened to his personal collections, if it ended up in a different museum, or if his family still has it, or if it all went in a dumpster. I don't know if anybody's ever included him in any history books. He seems to just be a name that sometimes pops up in relationship to various Air Force programs or other things. But he worked as a, I'm going to call him a lobbyist. I'm not sure that's the term he would have used for what he was doing. But he worked as a lobbyist to try and bring back the battleships. And in the end, he ended up being at least partially successful. The battleships weren't reactivated the way he wanted initially, but they were reactivated. And the reason his name comes up at all is because he was the first person to propose the battle carrier conversion in the 1970s, shortly before the ship is reactivated. And so early on in this project, when I'm trying to look into more information on the battle carrier conversion, I reached out to several other historians, and of course one of my mentors, Paul Stilwell, who is the historian on Battleship New Jersey, said, go out and find the New York Times magazine that talks about reactivating the ship, and it has a lot of information about Chuck Meyers in there. He was interviewed by William Honan for this article. And honestly, this article has changed how I think about Iowa-class battleships. And it's what's led me from researching the battle carriers down to researching the things in this sequel trilogy that we're talking about right now. And it doesn't seem like many of the history books cover the process of bringing the battleships back in the 1980s. They talk about how it's contentious, but they talk about it as a done deal. They don't go back and talk about what steps had to be taken along the way to get there. So the very first step is taken by Charles Meyers. He was an Army bomber pilot during World War II. He operated in the Western Pacific flying B-25s, and a lot of their tasks were attacking Japanese shipping. So he knew how vulnerable shipping was to aircraft. He goes back to school, and then during the Korean War, he joins the Navy, gets retrained as a pilot, and flies Panthers off Bonhomme Richard during the Korean War. So he flies close air support fighter bomber missions in combat during the Korean War. After the war, he works as a test pilot. He was the head test pilot in the F-106 Delta Dagger. So he set a world speed record flying that aircraft. And he worked in the development of several other aircraft and the procurement of several other aircraft, and was a member of what's been referred to as the Fighter Mafia. Fighter Mafia was a name that this group of fighter pilots chose for themselves based on the old World War II Bomber Mafia, the group of Army Air Force strategists who came up with the idea of employing heavy bombers strategically as a war-winning weapon system. So they were pejoratively referred to as the Bomber Mafia. Well, now, these group of fighter pilots during the Cold War era who were opposed to the way we were designing fighter planes, heavy fighter bomber mixed mission aircraft that were designed to engage enemy aircraft from long range, and therefore they didn't have to do a lot of maneuvering. And they were using these super fancy missiles and things like that. And they said, no. We need fighter planes that still have guns. They don't need external bomb rats. They should be cheap. They should be fast and maneuverable, because we can't identify a target at long range to fire because of our rules of engagement. We have to get close, and at close range, Russian MiGs are able to outturn and burn us in a dogfight. So Chuck Meyers is involved in the development of basically every airplane you can think of from the Cold War era, from the F-106, the A-10 Warthog, the F-14, 15, 16, 18, 111, and 117, and the B-2 bomber, the stealth program. Like, this guy is involved with aircraft across the board. How on earth does he go from the fighter mafia to saying we need to bring back a battleship? He was a carrier pilot, for God's sake. That's the really important part of this story, and the really interesting thing. When you look at who is interested in bringing back the battleships, it's not big Navy. There's no gun club in the 1980s that's advocating to bring battleships back. It's Marines and naval aviators who think that the battleship will be brought back. And we're going to talk about that more in one of the future videos. But Meyers is the guy who puts the idea forward and rallies all these supporters together to get it in front of Congress. Why does he do this? So after he retires from his career as a test pilot and working with some of these aircraft designers, he becomes a consultant for them. He's got all these connections, he knows people, so he does like most people who have worked in the five-sided building, and he becomes a consultant. So one of the things he did as a consultant was to do studies of the capabilities that are out there, and where there might be a need, so that the companies he works for can develop a product that will fill that need, that they can then put before the military or Congress or whoever to get it bought. So he looks around and he realizes that the Navy is set up to fight a surface battle. They're set up to deploy aircraft carriers around the world, but that's not really what they're going to be used for, especially in the late Cold War, where we're not planning on a full-scale war with the Soviet Union. We've got all these brush fire actions going on. Vietnam has very restricted rules of engagement, and then you've got things like the Lebanese Civil War, and you have things like Iran taking all those hostages and the Soviets invading Afghanistan. These are not situations in which the United States is going to go to full-scale war. These are situations where we're going to do a limited action to try and counter this, and in neither function was the U.S. military particularly successful. So he's looking at that is what the need is going to be. And he was right, because from there we go into the Lebanese Civil War and and Grenada and Panama and the Iran-Iraq tanker war and really the Gulf War to a lesser extent. So we got all these small things where the Navy isn't fighting surface battles. But the Navy has this one capability all in-house that nobody else can do, in that they can deliver an amphibious force just about anywhere in the world where it's needed. They can supply it, they can pull it out again when necessary, and they can provide support for it, because the Navy includes the Marine Corps, the folks who are going to land there. It's the supply ships to get them there, the transports, and it's the aircraft carriers that are going to be flying close air support. And it could also be the gunships that are going to provide the shore bombardment support that they might need. Except, at the time that he's looking at this, sometime around 1978, the last of our gun cruisers is being phased away, and it's been a decade since we've had a battleship in service. So he looks at this and like, why does the Navy not have battleships? And the best answer he can come up with is because it doesn't support the Navy. Bringing back battleships doesn't support the Navy's mission. It's going to support the Marine Corps. It's going to support the Army. It's not something that's going to directly support the Navy, so the Navy's not really interested in it. Plus, reactivating an old ship, why would you do that when you could be going in for money for a new ship? And during this time period, the Navy is looking for several new classes of ships. They're trying to get funding for additional Nimitz-class supercarriers. So why on earth would they spend money to bring back a 40-year-old ship? Anyway, no other ship has this sort of capability built into it. And so Meyers, the result of his study is that battleships have this capability. So this is a capability that Meyers believes that the Navy needs, but that the Navy doesn't necessarily want because it doesn't support them. So the counter-argument, of course, is that naval aviation can do this far more precisely. But Meyers is a Navy fighter bomber pilot. He knows the fighter aircraft can't provide support in all weather. They can't sustain the level of support that a gunship can. And you can shoot down a fighter plane. That's hugely expensive. You can kill or capture the pilot, who is a highly trained, valuable asset. But for gunships, you can't shoot down that shell. And hey, maybe the shell misses. It's fine. Shoot a couple more. He sees this as a real need, and he starts to investigate it, and he reaches out to some of his former Navy contacts and historians, and they put him in touch with Admiral Snyder and Captain Peniston, the two commanding officers from New Jersey during her most recent commission, and they say that the ship was put away in great condition. She didn't need a whole lot of work to be brought back. The Iowas are in great shape. He goes to Battleship North Carolina, at that time already a museum ship, and looks around, and that ship is in fantastic condition and in theory could be brought back to service. So the ones that the Navy had maintained longer, the Iowa class, are almost certainly ready to go. So he starts putting this idea out there. One of the first places he does is in that Naval Institute Proceedings magazine article where he advocates for this sort of battle carrier. And the rest is history, which is exactly why we're going to continue to talk about it. And we're going to go into more depth about that stuff in our future videos. So keep an eye out for that. Just doing a little bit more research before we film those, so they'll come out within a week or two of this, hopefully. Now, unfortunately, like I said earlier on, there isn't a great body of work out there on Chuck Meyers. The article by Honan is pretty good, and there's some obituaries and awards and things for him online that are available. But if you happen to work for another museum, like I know many of you do, and you know where his collection might have ended up if his family had gotten rid of it, if you happen to be like, oh, I'm related to Chuck Meyers, or hey, I'm friends with Chuck Meyers, I know the family, give us some contact information for someone to reach out to. I'd love to find out more about him to continue this research. Please do not just start digging and reaching out to people at random. Don't go hunting for folks. Charles E. Meyers Jr. is actually a relatively common name, so don't just start cold calling people. But if you do have a personal connection with him or his family, please do reach out, because I'd be interested in talking to them and learning more about him. Had you ever heard about him before? Would you believe it if I had told you before this video that there's a single person responsible for reactivating the battleships and it's not anybody you've heard of? Let us know in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to donate to support the channel. It allows us to continue to do research like this into new aspects of the ship's history. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about us and the channel. Stay tuned for future videos in this series, and thanks for watching.